Well, hello, my dear friends. Justyn Smith here, and welcome back to the channel. Today we are in Psalm 74 with this topic and title, Remember Thy Congregation. And this is really a plea that the people are bringing before God because of difficult days. I don't know if you know what it's like to go through difficult days, but oftentimes your faith is tried in God during difficult days, difficult seasons of life. We are going to examine Psalm 74 today to understand that even though there were questions given to God, and even though we find the statement, remember thy congregation, the people would ultimately remember God and seek Him. Notice point 1, questions for God. Have you ever had questions for God? Notice verse 1, O God, why hast thou cast us off forever? Why doth thine anger smoke against the sheep of thy pasture? Have you ever been in a position where you thought God had left you for good? He'd left you forever. Well, that's what the psalmist is considering. That's what the people of God are considering in this season of life, against the sheep of thy pasture. Why are you angry with us? It ought to be that you would have responded by now. These are some of the questions that they had in their day in the writing of Psalm 74, and it's certainly something that you and I could think about in the days of trouble that we presently possess. Number 2, there is a plea for God to remember His congregation. And this goes in line with our topic and title. Verse 2 says, Remember thy congregation, which thou hast purchased of old, the rod of thine inheritance, which thou hast redeemed, this Mount Zion, wherein thou hast dwelt. And of course, we are dealing with Old Testament days. We are dealing with history past. The Messiah has not come for the first time to give His life a ransom, to redeem people from the iniquity of their sins. Yet at the same time, there is the understanding that God has purchased His people. There is the understanding that God has redeemed His people in an Old Testament way, that His people are the inheritance. So God, why have you forgotten us? You need to remember your congregation. You gave so much for us. Sometimes today, in 2023, whatever year it is that you're listening to this video, and even though we live in the day where Christ has purchased us by His blood, we still feel like God has forgotten us. We still feel like God has a need to remember us because we are in so much trouble right now. Now, hopefully you're not in a valley. Hopefully you're not in a storm. Hopefully you are right where you ought to be. But as far as ought to be in the place of the mountaintop, as far as life's good experiences. But anybody who lives in this life understands that there are valleys, but valleys have a way of shaping us and showing us who our God is. We can trust Him today. That leads to point number 3, and this is still in the prayer toward God. Put feet and eyes to the destruction which the enemy has done. There is such a desire for God to have His attention given to their particular need that the continuing verses are a desire to get the attention of God. Notice verse 3, lift up thy feet unto the perpetual desolations, even all that the enemy hath done wickedly in the sanctuary. So God, would you put feet to it, and would you lay eyes to it, okay? Would you just walk over and see what the enemy has done in his wickedness, even in the sanctuary? Thine enemies roar in the midst of thy congregations. They set up their ensigns for signs. Now pause right there and consider that it's in the congregation where God ought to be named and known, but the enemy has been found within the congregation. Lord, remember thy congregation, as it said in verse 2. Now verse 5, 5 goes on to say that a man was famous. According to this, he had lifted up axes upon the thick trees. So imagine a lumberjack with me, if you would please. Imagine the skill and ability of the one who is utilizing that tool. And then read verse 6. But now they break down the carved work thereof at once with axes and hammers. So in verse 5, you talk about the skill and the importance of an axeman. But that axeman is now within the tabernacle or the house of God, the sanctuary, and literally tearing it apart with such tools. In verse 7, they have cast fire into the sanctuary. They have defiled by casting down the dwelling place of thy name to the ground. They said in their hearts, let us destroy them together. They have burned up all the synagogues of God in the land. We see not our signs. There is no more any prophet, neither is there among us any that knoweth how long. And so again, we're going back to that third point, which is God put feet and eyes to the destruction with the enemy, or which the enemy has done. Don't you see? Walk over the land and recognize. Look and see our trouble. The enemy has been even within thy congregation, even within thy sanctuary, and has cut down and burned down. And we don't see any of our signs anymore. We only see the signs of the enemies. We don't see any of our prophets anymore. There is nobody who knows how long you are going to stay away from working in our midst. Have you ever been there before where you questioned God to this degree and asked God to move among you? Well, that could lead to further questions. Where are you, God? Leading to our fourth point, questions to God again. Listen to the next two verses, verse 10 and 11. O God, how long shall the adversary reproach? Shall the enemy blaspheme thy name forever? Why withdrawest thou thy hand, even thy right hand, pluck it out of thy bosom? In essence, as these questions are being asked, it's like God just has his hands still against his chest. He's not doing anything. He is just observing, and yet the people think he's not even observing, that he doesn't even know. And yet at this point, they're asking God, God, how long are you going to let the enemy blaspheme thy name? And maybe you feel like you are in a position where the enemy is just wreaking havoc. I mean, doing everything that enemies do against you and the cause of God. And I'm talking about you are legit following God right now, and the enemy is waging war. And you're asking God, God, why? Why are you allowing the enemy to blaspheme your name? Well, in moments like this, when it seems like God is not there, when it seems like God does not care, we need to remember our fifth point. There is a recalling of who God is, coupled with a plea for God to arise in their desperate situation. Now, I have several verses to read through the end of the chapter. We're going to take some time to look at a few of them, if not all of them. This is so important for us in the midst of our trial to recognize that we need a correct recollection of God, asking him to arise. Verse 12, for God is my King of old. So even though I've had questions, God is my King, working salvation in the midst of the earth. So he's at work. Thou didst divide the sea by thy strength. Thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters. Thou breakest the heads of the Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. And so right now we are talking about God's power in the sea, God's power over animals of the sea, and how God could even use it to provide for his people who were within the wilderness. In verse 15, thou didst cleave the fountain and the flood, thou driest up mighty rivers. Verse 16, continuing, talking about the power of God over everything that we see and feel in this life. The day is thine, the night also is thine. Thou hast prepared the sun and the light and the sun. Thou hast set all the borders of the earth. Thou hast made summer and winter. So get this, as we're reading these verses, not only are there the borders to the earth, like, okay, if I drive in my car down to Florida, I will eventually hit the border of the earth. If I drive all the way out west to California, I eventually will hit the border of the earth against the water of the sea. So God set the borders. He set the boundaries of this earth, dry land to dry land, sea to sea. He's also made the seasons. Remember this, that the enemy hath reproached, O Lord, and that the foolish people have blasphemed thy name. So after there is a recall, let me pause right here and go back to the screen. After there's a recall of the strength of God and what God has created and what God has done, it's like this prayer is being utilized to get the attention of God, to simply say, God, I know you can do it. Now remember what the enemy has done against you. Oh, deliver not the soul of thy turtle dove unto the multitude of the wicked. Forget not the congregation of thy poor forever. And in that verse, it's like there is this recalling to mind of who the people of God are to God, the turtle dove, this congregation of the poor. We are helpless without you. We are your beloved. Do for us what we cannot do, O God. Have respect unto the covenant, for the dark places of the earth are full of the habitations of cruelty. O let not the oppressed return ashamed. Let the poor and needy praise thy name. And so, God, we want to get to the point where we're praising your name regardless of what type of life we have come from, poor and needy. We don't want the oppressed to come back ashamed. We want them to be able to have praise on their lips toward you and who you are and what you have done for them. And that recollection leads the people to cry out to God, arise. Arise, O God, plead thine own cause. Remember how the foolish man reproacheth thee daily. And so, God, I'm not asking you to plead my cause. I'm asking you to plead your cause. I'm asking you to get up and fight for your covenant because I know it means something to you. There was purpose in that covenant that was established all those generations ago, and you are at the work of fulfilling your word. Salvation is yours. Arise. And it's not that God needs a cheerleader at this moment, okay? But at the same time, there is a desperate cry from a people who are hurting. Dear God, save us. Dear God, help us. The enemy is at work and the enemy has destroyed. Arise, oh God. And maybe you feel like you're in that moment where you're crying out just like they did. Remember thy congregation, Lord. Remember me. Remember your work. Remember what you have done. Help us. We need you. Your cry today is arise. Dear friend, I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for click and play. It means a lot that you've chosen to watch through the duration of this video again. Thank you for liking and sharing if you would desire to do so. That would certainly be a blessing to the work of the ministry here. Until next time, I pray that you purpose to be back with us again. Have a blessed day.